Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of the Green Bean podcast. My name is Katie and this is Jack, and this is our podcast, my podcast, about my creative practice, which includes drawing and knitting and sewing, and it's Jack's podcast about his adventures out on Dartmoor in Devon, which is close to where we live. We're really glad that you're here to join us, whether this is your very first time visiting or you've been with us many times before. Welcome. And I've got a rather full episode for you today. It's been a long time since I recorded, so I'm feeling a little bit more nervous than usual. I don't think Jack's got any performance anxiety, but I am certainly feeling a little bit rusty. But I've got lots of things to talk about because, like I said, it's been a long time since I recorded, and I've also been very busy during that time. So this episode includes quite a few drawing projects that I want to tell you about, 2 new knitting projects, and a little bit of sewing, as well as a couple of new things that I want to introduce to the podcast. So settle in. I hope that you're comfortable, and let's start by taking you out for a walk on the moors. I feel like I have so much to tell you today. I don't really know where to start. It has been such a whirlwind month. Has it only been a month? So much has happened. Where shall I begin? I guess I'll begin with the Green Bean. So my little zine, which I've been working on since I started recording this podcast and for 4 years before that, finally came out last month, and I just can't tell you how happy it made me to have that finished object in my hands. I haven't spoken in too much depth about the past 5 years and the hiatus I was taking from creating artwork full-time, but it was half forced upon me by health issues. So to get to a point where I had moved past that and was able to focus full-time on my artwork again and see this project through to completion has really meant a lot to me. But not quite as much as the response that you've all had to it. It's been incredible to be sending green beans out to people all over the world and to hear how much you're enjoying it. I love it. I love sending something that I'm so passionate about out to you and hearing that you enjoy it as well. So thank you so much. While that was going on, I've also been working on several commissions that had to remain secret while I was doing them. So it was quite tricky in January and February when I was very busy making artwork not to be able to tell you about it. But all of those commissions that I was working on then have now been brought out into the public, and I can tell you about them. And there's one in particular that I really want to show off to you today, which is a piece that I worked on for my friends at Arbon Textiles. If you don't know John Arbon, then they have a mill, a fibre mill in North Devon, which sounds like it's close to where I live, but it's not that close. It's almost 2 hours drive away from where I live. So local, but not that local. And they invited me to contribute to their annual. I'm going to grab it for you. It's here. So this is their annual issue 1. So this is the very first year that they've had this publication. So I was delighted when they invited me to make a contribution to it. Well, several contributions actually. So I contributed some of the more playful elements, shall we say, and it really appealed to the kind of work that I like to do. So they commissioned me to make a word search and a spot the difference puzzle, and then my favourite piece of all, which is this Where's Wally style drawing of their mill, which features 10 iterations of their cat Mr. Smoke in various different hiding places. So the idea is that you study the illustration and find out where Mr. Smoke is hiding. And I just had the best time working on this drawing, you can probably tell. I got to go up and visit in the mill. I think it was the end of January, it was possibly February, so it was absolutely freezing. I spent the day in there drawing, wearing my coat and gloves and shawl to keep me warm. But it was so much fun, you know, being there, seeing the machines working and being able to draw them from life rather than just from photos. It was a great project to work on. So yeah, that's been loads and loads of fun. The annual is a collection of various different patterns and bits of information and activities relating to John Arbon and their mill. So it gives you more information about all of their yarn ranges, including which breeds they use. It's got little interviews with all of their members of staff, including Mr. Smoke the cat. And it's got 3 knitting and 1 crochet pattern, which are all gorgeous, I have to say. I feel like I want to cast on all 4 of them. And it's got the activities, which are what I contributed. And the one that I really want to talk about the most is the Find Mr. Smoke, because it really appealed to that part of me that wanted to be an illustrator when I was a kid. I don't know if you remember the Where's Wally books. They were very much part of growing up in my house. There were several different versions of them. I can't remember if we had them or we always used to get them from a library. But they were just these spreads of very detailed illustrations where you had to find the character Wally and variously his dog, his girlfriend, his worst enemy, his friend the wizard, various different characters, and you had to find them amongst these really complicated and detailed illustrations. And they were actually quite hard. Quite often I remember not succeeding, although I was quite young. But it was lovely to be invited to create an illustration along those lines. So I worked on it in various stages. I made 2 visits to the mill, the first of which I took photos, and then I came home and sketched out the layout in pencil. The first thing I had to do was to get all of the shapes and perspective right, because I was doing a view inside the building, which you can't actually get to as a human. In order to take a picture of that view, you would have to be on some kind of winch halfway up hanging from the ceiling, which is not possible. So I had to imagine what it would look like from that view, looking downwards into the space, and figure out how all of the elements of the machines and the staircases and stuff would fit together. And there is an element of fantasy in it because I was limited by the size and shape of the piece of paper. So it's not relative. I wasn't measuring everything out exactly perfectly as it would be, but it had to make sense as an illustration. It would just look weird if the perspective was wrong. So I put all of that skeleton framework in place, and that's the point at which I visited the mill to start the really detailed observational drawings of the machines. And I actually spent a day there observing the machines working and getting my head around precisely how things looked. It was really helpful to do that in person. And once I'd finished the ink work, which took quite a long time, I erased all of the pencil marks and then I coloured in the drawing using coloured inks. I've mentioned before on the podcast that I prefer coloured inks over watercolours because once they're dry, they become permanent. So you don't have that issue of the colours bleeding into one another or blending into the colour you've put underneath. Once you've put a colour down, it stays. So you very much have to work from the light colours to the darker colours, the same as you would do with watercolours. But personally, I just find them easier to work with without making the colours look all muddy. So I did the ink over several days, and then I just added some detailed shading to a couple of things with a bit of coloured pencil where I couldn't get enough detail with the paintbrush, some very fine shadows and bits and pieces. It was such a fun project to work on. Like almost every project I ever do, it took probably about 3 times as long as I expected it to, but it didn't really matter because I was having such a great time. Another project that I was working on in secret was the launch of my wooden brooches, which I'm sure many of you have seen by now on Instagram or Etsy. But if you haven't, I am wearing one of the star himself, Mr. Jack. But I also made versions of 12 different sheep breeds, which I chose from my British sheep breeds poster. And I made these in collaboration with my friend Faye Dashper-Hughes. If you don't know Faye, you should. She's wonderful. She hosts the Crochet Circle podcast, which I really, really enjoy. If you're not a crocheter, don't be put off by the word crochet. It's a podcast really for anyone who's interested in fibre arts and crafts. And yeah, she has wonderful content, so I really recommend checking her podcast out. But she also has another business called Knit It, Hook It, Craft It, where she sells various supplies, project bags, beautiful project bags, notions, and she really takes a lot of care in sourcing her materials. And something that Faye is developing as part of that business is working with her laser cutting machine called Mistress Badass. And as soon as I learned that Faye had such a machine in her possession, I knew that I wanted to collaborate with her on something. And these badges are the result. It's been such a joy to work with her. And so I decided to make the badges out of solid beechwood, which Faye sourced for me from Germany. Quite often when you see laser cut products, they're done on plywood, which looks okay, but Faye did a few examples for me and I really liked how the solid wood looked. and smelled. I couldn't believe when I opened the parcel, as well as the joy of seeing their little sheepy faces for the first time, just the smell of the wood was incredible. So yeah, there was a lovely moment opening that parcel from Faye. And the badges have been really well received as well. I'm really pleased with how they've gone down. So I'm hoping that over the next year or so, I'll be able to introduce some more sheep breeds and maybe some other animals as well. Who knows? With all of the busyness that I've had going on, I kind of lost my way with my knitting for a while, and it took me by surprise because I normally rely on my knitting as my relaxation activity, the thing that I like to do at the end of the day when I finished work, to cuddle up on the sofa with Jack and put in a few rows before I go to bed. And well, I mean, the first thing that was happening is that I was working extra long days, so I didn't have that time in the evening to relax. I was working until it was time to go to bed, so that time was missing. But even when I had that time, I wasn't feeling like I wanted to knit. I guess partially because I was just so tired. I wanted to just lie there and watch TV instead. But also, I think I was feeling a bit stuck with my projects. And if you follow me on Instagram, I made a post a couple of weeks ago about feeling slightly overwhelmed by the amount of works in progress that I had and feeling a bit stuck with them all. And I got such lovely responses from people of things that I might do to try and help with that feeling of being stuck and overwhelmed. Quite a lot of conflicting advice, which you would imagine. But I think that one of the things that had me stuck was this commitment that I made earlier in the year to being a monogamous knitter, or working only on one project at a time. So first things first, that had not worked. I still had 6 projects on the needle, so it hadn't helped me finish any of my current works in progress. But it also made me feel cramped in that I couldn't cast on anything new. So I was feeling bogged down by the projects that I had. Even though I still love them all and I want to finish them, they weren't feeling like what I wanted to work on. At the same time as beating myself up for wanting to cast on something new and not letting myself move forward. So I decided the best thing to do was to remove that rule about being monogamous, because it clearly wasn't working for me. So what did I do? I cast on 2 new things. And so for the very first time in this podcast, I'm going to talk to you about 2 knitting projects, because I'm actually working on them concurrently and really enjoying them both. The first of which is this one, which is a new jumper project. So this is the Canisp jumper by Emily K. Williams, who goes by the name of Flutter My Knits. And it's a recently published design. She brought it out for the first time at Edinburgh Yarn Festival, but she was sharing it on Instagram a few weeks beforehand, and I just fell in love with it. It's an ingenious design, and I'm going to try my best to explain it to you, but I'm also going to put in a couple of Emily's photos to help explain, because it's a deceptively simple looking jumper. It's a striped jumper in 2 colours, horizontal stripes, but what happens is the stripes are contiguous across the sleeve, so they'll go stripes across the body, and then the sleeves are knitted on the bias so that when you hold your arm in this position, the stripes continue and they line up with the body. So those stripes go up and over the shoulder, and then it has this beautiful seam down the back where the stripes intersect in different directions. And I think it's a marvellous work of mathematics and architecture. I would not have wanted to write this pattern, but I'm completely intrigued by it. It's a really unique construction. And also, sometimes I find when knitting projects have that unique or experimental construction, the result is not something that's particularly wearable. Whereas this is such a wearable jumper, I think it's going to be just a really classic piece that's going to fit easily into my wardrobe, especially because I've chosen grey as my colour. So I knew straight away that I wanted to cast on this project, and I quite fancied the recommended yarn, which is Devonia by John Arbon Textiles. That's a yarn that's all spun from Devon fibres, so it very much appeals to my desire to knit things as locally as I can. But I couldn't find a combination of 2 colours that I really liked, and very much central to this design is the concept that it's knitted in stripes of 2 colours. You can't really do a 1 colour version, there's not really any point. So I went for John Arbon's Exmoor Zwarbles, which is a blend of Zwarbles, or Zwartbles, I think is the correct pronunciation. I'm sorry if there are any Dutch viewers, please feel free to correct me. It is a naturally dark brown sheep breed, so that's what lends the grey colour to these yarns. And then the white is Exmoor Blueface, which is a cross between Exmoor Horn, which is one of our local breeds, and Blueface Leicester, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. And that's the white. So obviously this darker shade has more of the Zwartbles in it, and the paler shade has more of the Exmoor Blueface. And there is a 3rd shade in the range. I've got the 2 darker greys. There is another one lighter as well. But I picked the 2 darker greys. I thought they'd be the most wearable for me. And it smells incredible. It smells so sheepy, and yeah, I'm really happy with my choice. And it's worsted spun, the same as Devonia, the recommended yarn. So I think it's going to behave quite similarly. I didn't have any problem getting the right gauge for the project, so hopefully I've made a good choice. Now, me being me, I have made a couple of modifications to the pattern because I seem to be completely incapable of doing exactly what I'm told. And they're not big modifications, though one of them was actually an accident. And that is that I did a tubular cast on because that's my favourite cast on for a bottom-up jumper. And then I just carried right on doing 1x1 ribbing, not noticing that the pattern calls for 2x2. So I'm a little bit frustrated because I do find my 1x1 ribbing to be a bit ugly. Not ugly, but it's a bit loose and wobbly, whereas my 2x2 is always neater. And I know I'm not the only knitter who has this problem. I think it's something to do with how I tension the yarn twisting around my hand that puts some extra twist into it and makes my 1x1 rib look awkward. But anyway, 1x1 is what I did. and we're going with it because I'm not going to rip it out and do it again. The other change is more significant, and that is you'll see that I'm knitting this piece flat, and the pattern is actually written for you to knit the jumper in the round from the waist up to the underarm. There's a couple of reasons I chose not to do that. The first of which is long-term viewers will know that I prefer knitting flat to knitting in the round. I just like to have the change of rhythm between knitting and purling. Suits me better than just knitting around and around and around in a circle. But the second thing is that my tension varies quite a lot between knitting in the round and knitting flat. And because parts of this jumper are knitted flat, the sleeves are knitted flat, I wanted to match my tension across the body. So I decided to knit the main body in 2 flat pieces and seam them together later, rather than knit them in the round and then separate and knit flat for the sleeves and risk getting a different gauge. So hopefully that will work out. And so far I'm really enjoying it. It's nice to have a fresh project on the needles. It's also really nice to have a project that is just plain stocking stitch for a while. One of the things that's been holding me back with my other knitting projects that have been lying around is that they're all a little complicated. I mean, not complicated like they're too hard, but they require a little bit more thought, which means they're not necessarily the thing you feel like doing at the end of a working day when you're tired, or when you're in a social situation, a knitting group or something like that. You don't want to have to deal with reading cable charts or colourwork charts or counting, that kind of thing. Whereas 12.5 inches of plain stocking stitch in alternating stripes is perfect for that kind of TV knitting. So I'm really enjoying getting my teeth into this project so far. The second knitting project I'm going to share with you is a bit of a shocker in several different ways. The first of which is that it's a sock. And if you know me at all as a knitter, you will know that I don't take great pleasure in knitting socks, or at least I haven't in the past. And I've no idea really why that is. I certainly enjoy wearing knitted socks. I can't think of any practical reason other than I'm not very good at knitting second items, mittens, sleeves, socks, etc. I also, because I'm a very loose knitter, I have to use tiny, tiny needles to knit socks, so that's slightly off-putting as well. But yeah, I've always avoided sock knitting to a certain point, but it's got to a point now in my progress towards a handmade wardrobe where actually socks are a priority item. I've got a passable number of jumpers and dresses and lovely things to wear, but all of my store-bought socks are starting to get holes in them. And I'm up for darning them, but I'm more up for having some hand-knitted socks to replace them. So the process has started, and it started with seeing a new pattern that's published by my friend Katherine, who is Fibre and Sustenance on Instagram. Fibre spelt the American way. I always forget when I'm searching for her, and then I'm reminded to spell it correctly, and that makes it easier. She published this pattern a few weeks ago. It's called the Burgeon socks, and as you can see, they've got little textured bobbles on them. And the pattern is written for a single colour of yarn. I think she wrote it for Mondim by Rosa Pomar. So it's a variegated yarn, and her sample socks, the bobbles come up in blue or yellow, whereas the main sock is variegated blue and yellow. I decided to do mine with a contrast because I just thought it would be fun. And I've also done a bit of that contrast in colour in the cast on, and hopefully I'm going to have enough to do it for the heel and toe as well, because I want these socks to be quite playful. I think as my first pair of hand knitted socks for myself ever, they need to be fun to keep me going past the initial excitement of the bobbles and get me onto that second sock. The other thing that's a first for me about this project is that it's my first time knitting with hand-dyed superwash merino. And that probably comes as a surprise because I think it is a yarn that most people have knitted with, most people have been attracted to, and it really has never much appealed to me. And that's because my kind of way into knitting as an obsession rather than just a thing I did occasionally if I wanted to make something for a new baby or something like that, was through British sheep reeds. So I got really interested in sheep reeds when Rowan brought out their British sheep reeds collection. I reckon it must have been, I'm not even going to try and guess how many years ago. Some years ago it was, and that was really my gateway into the knitting world, was discovering different British sheep reeds and learning about wool. And so superwash merino was never something that was particularly on my radar. And I'm also not a huge fan of bright colours, neons, and strongly variegated yarns. They just don't appeal to me. I can appreciate them as a work of art, but they're not my cup of tea. So a lot of hand-dyed yarn is not really for me. It was only when I discovered Viola, which is dyed by lovely Emily Foden in Canada, that I started to understand the appeal of hand-dyed yarn. And it goes without saying that this is Emily's hand-dyed yarn. It's a superwash merino and nylon sock blend. I think it's 75-25, 75% merino, 25% nylon. And I think it's going to make a really good sock yarn. I'm generally one of those people who's quite cold. I feel the cold, but my feet get really hot. So I often find that proper woolly walking socks in my walking boots are too hot for me even in the winter. So I'm hopeful that this superwash, which kind of, what's the word? I want to say reduces is not the right word. It kind of, maybe reduces is the right word. It limits some of the natural properties of wool that make it felt and make it stick together, but also I think it flattens down the scales on the fibres. So I'm hoping it will be slightly less warm than a woolen spun or a more kind of rustic woolly wool sock would be. We shall see. Now, something I wanted to show you was the way that I did these contrasting coloured bobbles. So when I wanted to make a bobble, I just joined in the new yarn, and full disclosure, I will show you the wrong side of my sock because it's a little hairy. And I don't see any reason why I need to weave all of these ends in. They're not loops, so they're not going to catch anything, and I think if I trim them too short, the knots that I've used to fasten the bobbles might come undone. So I'm going to trim them to the point where they don't poke above the top of my sock. But other than that, I'm just going to leave them like that. Shh, don't tell anyone. Sewing wise, the major project I've been working on is this dress that I'm wearing, which is the apron dress from the assembly line. And I found out about this pattern from my friend Fiona, who has made a version for herself, and I was jealous. So I bought the pattern for myself and decided to make my own version. My friend Fiona's version was in a denim, and probably I'll make a denim one for myself at some point. But I knew that I had seen Daughter of a Shepherd was bringing out a Hebridean tweed cloth, and I knew that that's exactly what I wanted to make this dress out of. So as soon as she made that fabric available for sale, I went and snapped up a length and got to work on my dress. Now I want to say something quite specific about the sizing of this dress because I think it's relevant to people who are interested in making it. I made the size small from the pattern, and I was able to get that cut out of 1.5 meters of fabric. So the fabric is 1.5 meters wide, and I had 1.5 meters length. So I had a large square piece of fabric. And I say this because the recommendation from the pattern was that I needed 1.6 meters, so I could get away with slightly smaller. And it's relevant because quite often you can only buy fabric in 0.5 meter increments. So that was helpful to save having to buy that extra 0.5 meter just to get an extra 10 centimeters. It turns out with careful placement of the pattern pieces, it wasn't necessary. But what I will say is that I think it might work for some of the larger sizes too. And that's because these shoulder straps have a considerable amount of excess length. So the shoulder strap is actually, the length comes down to here. And that is where the extra length is required in cutting the fabric. So if you were careful, I think you could cut even the medium or the large out of 1.5 meters, depending on where you place things, and sacrificing a little bit of that length in the shoulder strap, which I don't think is completely necessary. So yeah, I was really, really glad to be able to get it out of 1.5 meters because it wasn't an inexpensive fabric, but it's been such a delight to sew with. I have sewn with tweed before and I found it quite difficult, but this was easier, I found, than the used wool which I used for my skirts last year. I think this is slightly finer, and also something about the way the yarn is spun, that it's got there's a lot of air in it, so I found even when I was sewing it that my sewing machine didn't complain. I think that's the main problem I had with the used wool, is my sewing machine found it a little bit heavy to cope with, and this just went through my machine like a breeze. It was a pleasure to sew with, and I thoroughly enjoyed making this dress. One of the many things I will say in its favour, this pattern, is that it entirely consists of straight lines, so it's very easy sewing. The only thing that was slightly stressful was adding the buttonholes to the back. But other than that, it was pretty straightforward and quick. Modifications I made, I'm going to stand up briefly, I'm not sure how it'll show. I made rounded pockets, so the pattern calls for a square pocket, and I just decided to make them rounded. And the other thing that I did was I added a silk lining. This has become my new obsession since I put a lining in my checked dress, which I made recently. It's the most luxurious fabric against my skin. What you find with wool particularly, but also I find with cotton dresses as well, is that if you're wearing tights underneath, they stick and then they bunch and then it's all unflattering and uncomfortable. But having that layer of silk underneath, or, a polyester lining does the same job. But I'm really trying to reduce the amount of unnecessary plastic in my life. So choosing silk feels slightly more environmentally friendly, even if it is very much more expensive and a little bit indulgent. It just felt like the right thing to put with this tweed cloth. I felt like it would have been slightly insulting it to put it with a polyester lining. Does that make any sense? Anyway, I put in a silk lining for the whole dress apart from the straps. So the lining starts with the bib and goes all the way around and to the full length of the skirt. I'm really, really glad I took the time to do that. I think it was a good decision. Now, something new for this episode, I want to start introducing you to some of my favourite books on the podcast. It was always a really important feature of the paper green bean in its initial incarnation that I would include book reviews, because reading books is a hugely important part of my life. And it didn't quite feel right to me to put them in the new green bean, although I'm not saying that they'll never make it in there. But I thought that it would be a nice bit of content to add to the podcast. So the book I've been reading recently is this book called Gathering Moss by an author called Robin Kimmerer. And I'm going to be honest about how I get most of my book recommendations. I actually get them by browsing Amazon. So I will look at, when you look at a book, it comes up with people who bought this also reviewed this item, all of those suggestions at the bottom. I have to say that's where I find most of my book recommendations these days. And this book popped up in my recommendations there. So it's a non-fiction book about, it says, a natural and cultural history of mosses. Don't be put off if that sounds like the most boring thing ever, even if you're not interested in mosses. But my fascination with natural history and lichens and mosses and all things green. So this was an instant appeal for me. And I think the thing that excites me most about it is that Robin Kimmerer is a Native American author, and her style of writing combines her indigenous wisdom, or ways of knowing, she calls it, with her scientific approach. And I just found that really fascinating. So the book is written in a really approachable way. You don't have to be a biologist to enjoy reading it. And it just presents the most fascinating facts and information about mosses and their lifestyle and what they contribute to the greater ecosystem. Things that I never knew, even though I've studied biology for years and years. It was really, really engaging. And I confess at one point it made me cry. I'm not going to spoil it too much by telling you what happened there, but I absolutely loved this book. I haven't yet looked to see if she's written any other books. But it certainly left me wanting more and feeling like I want to find out more about mosses and look up for other books that might engage me in the same way. I wanted to finish this episode by telling you about the next thing that's on the horizon for me, which seems to have crept up awfully soon. I think part of my brain is still stuck in January, and so May feels like a long way away, but May is coming up in a couple of weeks, and with it I have a big trip to America. I will be travelling to Kansas City to attend LitUp Festival, which is a literary festival organised by teenagers for teenagers. And I'll be there to talk about my graphic memoir, Lighter Than My Shadow. And I'm really, really excited about it. I know I love any opportunity to travel abroad, and it's such a privilege that my book has afforded me many of those opportunities. So I'm really looking forward to seeing a different part of America and having the opportunity to talk to some people of the age that I was when I was going through those struggles. It's going to be really special. But also as part of that trip, I am taking a little holiday. So I'm going to see my lovely friend Molly in Chicago, and my lovely friend Rachel in Charlotte, and my lovely friend Maria, who you might know as Ninja Chickens in North Carolina, and hopefully the other Maria, who is Woolen Forest, also in North Carolina. So I'm really looking forward to seeing all of these special ladies and having, frankly, a well-earned break from working. So I'm taking 3 weeks off. I will be having the week before I go away, the week that I am away, and then a week when I get home. So my Etsy shop will have no products in it for a while. I'm going to just leave the digital downloads available and take off all the other products while I have a long break. And when I'm back, I will have some things that have been missing restocked and some new surprises as well. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the Green Bean Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed hanging out with us and that I haven't just waffled on at you for too long after this long break. If you would like to support the podcast, we have a page on Patreon, and I'm happy to say that since we last recorded, we met our first target of 100 patrons, which meant that I bought Jack a very special toy. So there's a little video on Patreon of Jack enjoying his new toy to celebrate our reaching 100 patrons. And what I've decided to do is set a new target, which is a little bit higher. I'm aiming for 250 patrons to invest in a new piece of recording equipment for the podcast. I'd really like to get a gimbal, which is one of those, it's like a cage type thing. I'm not very good at this technical stuff, but it's a thing that you use to hold your camera so that you can carry it with you. For example, when you're out walking on Dartmoor, and take footage while you're walking without it bouncing, bumping, and generally causing the viewer of the footage to feel travel sick. So that's what I'd really like to do. I'd really like to be able to offer more of that outdoor footage for the podcast, which I know you all enjoy so much, and I really enjoy recording as well, but it can sometimes feel like it's a little tricky to take a camera and a tripod out onto our daily walks. So it'd be nice to have a piece of equipment that makes that a little bit easier. If you're not able to support on Patreon, don't worry. It's not obligatory, and the podcast the main podcast is always going to be free for people to watch here on YouTube. So I hope you've enjoyed catching up with us. Thank you so much for tuning in and for all the lovely comments and feedback that you leave. I really, really appreciate every single one. And I look forward to catching you next time. And so does Jack. Take care. Bye.